Margaret Thompson was a 72-year-old woman whose life exuded simplicity and warmth. She lived in a charming, single-story home in a peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The house, painted a soft yellow with white shutters, stood out among the maple-lined streets. Every autumn, the trees shed their fiery leaves, carpeting the sidewalks in shades of gold and amber. Margaret had a deep love for the changing seasons, finding joy in the crisp air and the sight of children laughing as they jumped into piles of leaves. Margaret's days were calm and predictable, revolving around her little routines. Widowed for over a decade, she had grown used to the quiet life, finding solace in her books, garden, and, most importantly, her loyal companion, Duke. Duke was a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that gleamed under the sunlight. His expressive eyes and unwavering loyalty had turned him into much more than just a pet. He was Margaret's family. The bond between them began when Margaret visited a local animal shelter 3 years ago. At the time, Duke had been a nervous wreck, rescued from an abusive situation. He was timid, his tail constantly tucked between his legs, and his barks barely above a whimper. Margaret, with her nurturing spirit, saw past his fear and chose him, whispering softly, "You and I are going to take care of each other, Duke." From that moment, they became inseparable. Duke transformed under Margaret's care. His confidence grew, and he became not only her protector but also her best friend. Margaret often joked with her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, about Duke being her knight in furry armor. Whenever Margaret ventured into her garden to tend to her vibrant hydrangeas or pick tomatoes from her small vegetable patch, Duke would follow, his tail wagging, always alert to her needs. Margaret's home was as cozy inside as it was outside. The living room had a plush beige sofa adorned with hand-knitted throws, a modest bookshelf filled with well-worn novels, and a fireplace that crackled during the colder months. Duke's bed, a thick cushioned mat, was strategically placed near the fireplace, a spot he loved. Above the mantel, a photo of Margaret and her late husband, Robert, rested in a delicate silver frame, a reminder of a love that had shaped her life. Their evenings were their favorite part of the day. Margaret would settle into her armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, and Duke would lie at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to nudge her hand for a pat. She would read aloud to him, her soft voice filling the room as the setting sun cast an amber glow through the windows. "You know, Duke," she said one evening, running her fingers through his fur, "life wouldn't be the same without you." Duke responded with a gentle bark, his brown eyes meeting hers as if he understood every word. This peaceful existence defined Margaret and Duke's life together, a life built on trust, love, and the unspoken promise of always being there for each other. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the golden sunlight streamed through the curtains of Margaret's bedroom. She woke up to the gentle sound of Duke's tail thumping against the wooden floor. Stretching with a soft groan, she glanced at the clock on her bedside table. 7:30 a.m., right on schedule. "Good morning, Duke," Margaret said, her voice warm and affectionate as she reached down to ruffle his fur. Duke wagged his tail enthusiastically, letting out a soft bark of excitement. He knew what mornings like this meant: a walk to the neighborhood bakery. Margaret dressed in her favorite knitted sweater, a deep maroon color that complemented her gray hair, and a comfortable pair of walking shoes. After clipping Duke's leash onto his collar, they stepped outside. The crisp air was filled with the scent of damp leaves and freshly brewed coffee wafting from the local cafes. The neighborhood was just starting to wake up, with a few joggers passing by and children waiting at the bus stop. Their walk to the bakery was usually uneventful, a cherished routine they both enjoyed. But today, something felt off. From the moment they left the house, Duke seemed unusually alert. His ears perked up, and his nose was constantly in the air, sniffing. He pulled on the leash more than usual, his sharp eyes darting toward every sound. "Easy, boy," Margaret said, her brow furrowing. "What's gotten into you today?" They continued down the familiar path, past the park where Duke often chased squirrels and the little library where Margaret sometimes exchanged books. But Duke's behavior remained tense. He stopped abruptly, sniffing a patch of grass near the corner. His tail stood stiff, and he let out a low growl. Margaret tugged gently on his leash. "Come on, Duke. There's nothing there." At the bakery, the usual warmth greeted them. The owner, Mr. Callahan, was a kind man in his 50s with a broad smile and flour-dusted apron. "Morning, Margaret." "Morning, Duke," he called out, reaching for a treat behind the counter. He always kept dog biscuits on hand for Duke. "Morning, Callahan," Margaret replied, smiling as she accepted the fresh loaf of sourdough she ordered every week. "Duke seems on edge today," Callahan remarked, watching the dog pace by the door. "Something spooked him?" "I don't know," Margaret said, glancing at Duke. "He's usually so calm." "Dogs have a sixth sense for things," Callahan said thoughtfully. "Might be worth paying attention." As they left the bakery, Duke's agitation only grew. He tugged harder on the leash, his ears swiveling toward a pair of men lingering across the street. Margaret noticed them too, one tall with a beanie pulled low over his face, the other wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. They seemed to be watching her, though they quickly averted their gazes when she looked their way. "Come on, Duke," Margaret murmured, her voice tinged with unease. She quickened her pace, gripping the leash tightly. The feeling of safety that usually accompanied their walks was replaced by a creeping sense of discomfort. As they neared home, Duke's behavior didn't improve. He kept looking over his shoulder, his body tense and ready. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Back inside, she locked the door behind her, bolted it for good measure, and knelt to face Duke. "What's wrong, boy?" she asked softly, running a hand through his fur. "You're making me nervous." Duke stared at her, his brown eyes intense as if trying to communicate something she couldn't quite understand. Margaret stood and peered out the window. The street appeared as quiet as ever, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing unease in her chest. Something about today wasn't right. The unease from the morning walk lingered as Margaret sat by the window, sipping her tea. Duke lay by her feet, his ears perked up at every sound. The autumn afternoon, usually so peaceful, felt heavy with an unfamiliar tension. Margaret couldn't shake the memory of the two men across the street. Their furtive glances, the way they seemed out of place in her quiet neighborhood. "Am I just being paranoid, Duke?" she asked aloud, her voice breaking the stillness of the room. Duke didn't respond, of course, but his intense gaze at the front door was unsettling. He let out a low growl every so often, as if he, too, felt something was wrong. Across the street, in a car parked inconspicuously by the curb, the two men sat in silence, watching Margaret's house. Tom, the taller of the two, adjusted his beanie and glanced at Mike, who was chewing gum and flipping through his phone. "She lives alone. No family coming around, no husband, no kids. Easy target," Tom said, his voice low and confident. Mike smirked, blowing a bubble before snapping it. "Yeah, but she's got that dog. Did you see the size of that thing? It's like a wolf." Tom rolled his eyes. "It's just a dog. A distraction at most. If we do this right, it won't be a problem." Mike raised an eyebrow. "And if it is?" Tom didn't answer, his jaw tightening as he stared at the house. Inside, Margaret tried to focus on her book, but the words on the page blurred together. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the men. She decided to call her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 houses down. Picking up the phone, Margaret dialed her number. "Hello?" Mrs. Peterson's cheerful voice answered. "Hi, Carol. It's Margaret," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I just wanted to check in. Have you noticed anything strange today? Maybe a couple of unfamiliar faces around the neighborhood?" There was a brief pause. "Can't say I have, dear." "Why? Did something happen?" Margaret hesitated. "I'm not sure. There were 2 men outside the bakery this morning. They were watching me. Or at least it felt like they were. And now I feel like someone's watching the house." "Oh, Margaret," Carol said, her voice tinged with concern. "Do you want me to come over? I could bring my son's old baseball bat for good measure." Margaret chuckled softly despite herself. "No, I think I'll be fine. Duke is on high alert today, and he doesn't miss a thing. Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to call. And maybe double-check your locks, just to be safe." "I will." "Thanks, Carol." After hanging up, Margaret moved to the front door, testing the lock and bolting it again. As she turned, she noticed Duke standing by the window, his nose pressed against the glass. His tail was rigid, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, Duke?" Margaret whispered, her pulse quickening. She followed his gaze and froze. The same two men were standing farther down the street, partially hidden behind a tree. One of them looked directly at her window. Margaret's heart raced. "Duke," she said quietly, placing a hand on his head. "Let's not panic." She pulled the curtains shut and backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she call the police? Was she overreacting? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was firm, deliberate, and sent a jolt of fear through her. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Duke barked ferociously, his body pressed against the door, ready to defend her at any cost. Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering over her cell phone. Something told her that this was just the beginning. The knock on the door had rattled Margaret, but she decided against opening it. She waited, holding her breath, as Duke barked furiously, his deep growl echoing in the small hallway. After a long, tense moment, there was no further sound. Whoever had been at the door was gone. Still, Margaret couldn't shake her unease. She checked through the peephole, her fingers trembling as she clutched the doorknob. The porch was empty. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back and turned to Duke, who hadn't moved from his post. His intense gaze remained fixed on the door. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. Maybe it was just a neighbor. She paced the living room, trying to focus her thoughts. She decided to call the non-emergency police line, just to report the suspicious behavior. The operator was polite but non-committal, assuring her that an officer would patrol the area later in the evening. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the day wore on, Margaret busied herself with chores to keep her mind occupied. She cleaned the kitchen, sorted through old photographs, and even baked a batch of cookies. Duke followed her everywhere, his movements deliberate, as if he were guarding her. Every small noise, a creak from the floorboards, the rustling of leaves outside, made them both jump. By late afternoon, Margaret sat down with a cup of tea, determined to relax. She turned on the TV for background noise and opened a novel. But no sooner had she begun to read than Duke was up again, pacing by the front door. "Duke, what is it?" Margaret asked, exasperated. She set down her book and approached him. His ears were up, his tail stiff, and he let out a low, guttural growl. Margaret peeked through the curtains, careful not to be seen. Down the street, a dark car idled by the curb. The engine was running, but the driver made no move to leave. Margaret's heart sank. It was the same car she had seen earlier, with the same two men inside. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the window. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mrs. Peterson again. "Carol, it's me. They're back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What? Who?" Carol's voice was sharp with concern. "The men I told you about. They're sitting in a car down the street, just watching. Call the police, Margaret." "Right now," Carol urged. "Don't take any chances." Margaret nodded, though Carol couldn't see her. "I will. Thank you." After hanging up, Margaret dialed 911. The operator listened carefully as she described the situation. "We'll send an officer to check it out," the operator assured her. "Stay inside and don't open the door for anyone." Margaret hung up, her heart pounding. She sat on the sofa, clutching her phone, while Duke remained by the door, his growls low but constant. Time seemed to crawl as she waited, every passing second stretching into an eternity. As evening fell, headlights flashed through the window, and Margaret let out a shaky breath. A police cruiser pulled up outside. Two officers stepped out, scanning the area before approaching her door. Margaret opened it cautiously, holding Duke back by his collar. "Good evening, ma'am," one of the officers said, tipping his hat. "I'm Officer Green, and this is Officer Martinez. You reported some suspicious activity?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice quivering. "There's a car down the street, 2 men inside. They've been watching my house all day." Green nodded. "We'll take a look. Stay inside and keep your doors locked." The officers headed toward the car, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Margaret watched nervously from the window as they approached. But when they reached the vehicle, it was empty. The doors were locked, and the men were nowhere to be seen. Green returned to the house, his expression calm but serious. "The car is registered to someone out of state. We'll run a check on it. In the meantime, let us know if you notice anything else unusual." Margaret thanked them and locked the door as they left. She turned to Duke, who was still on edge. "It's just us again, boy," she whispered. The house felt heavier than before, the air thick with tension. Margaret knew this wasn't over. Something was coming, and Duke seemed to sense it too. The hours after the police left were a mix of restless waiting and suffocating silence. Margaret moved through the house, checking every lock and window, her nerves frayed. Duke followed her like a shadow, his ears perpetually perked up, his eyes darting toward every creak and groan of the old house. Night descended quickly, blanketing the neighborhood in darkness. Margaret had never felt this vulnerable in her own home before. Normally, she loved the solitude of her house, but now it felt like a trap. She tried to convince herself that the police's presence earlier would have scared the men off, but the pit in her stomach said otherwise. "Duke, maybe I'm just being silly," she said aloud, sitting on the couch with him at her feet. She stroked his thick fur, finding some comfort in the rhythmic motion. "We'll be fine, right? The police are keeping an eye out." Duke didn't respond with his usual reassuring bark. Instead, he remained tense, his body coiled like a spring. The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Margaret had dozed off on the couch, her novel lying open on her lap. The quiet was shattered by a loud, jarring crash. Her eyes snapped open, and Duke sprang to his feet, barking furiously. The front door had been kicked in. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as two figures stormed into the house, Tom and Mike. They wore dark clothing and gloves, their faces partially obscured by scarves. Margaret barely had time to react before Duke lunged forward, positioning himself between her and the intruders. "Get the dog out of the way," Mike shouted, holding a crowbar in one hand. Tom hesitated, pulling out a knife. "Shut him up, or we won't get anywhere." Duke bared his teeth, growling low and deep. He didn't flinch as Tom took a step closer. Margaret scrambled for her phone on the coffee table, her fingers trembling as she tried to unlock it. "Don't move, lady," Tom barked, pointing the knife in her direction. "We're not here to hurt you if you cooperate." Margaret's voice quivered, but she managed to shout, "Get out of my house. The police know you're here." Her defiance only seemed to agitate them. Mike took a step forward, raising the crowbar, but Duke leaped at him with a ferocity Margaret had never seen. The impact knocked Mike backward, sending him crashing into the coffee table. The crowbar clattered to the floor as he screamed, "Get this damn dog off me!" Tom lunged at Duke, slashing with the knife, but the German Shepherd was faster. He dodged the blade and sank his teeth into Tom's arm, causing him to drop the weapon. Blood stained the carpet as Tom howled in pain, stumbling backward. Margaret seized the opportunity to call 911, her voice shaking as she described the situation. "2 men broke into my house. They're armed. Please, send help quickly." Duke continued to hold his ground, his growls echoing through the room. Every time one of the men tried to move, he lunged, forcing them back. Despite their size and weapons, the men seemed terrified of the dog. "Let's get out of here," Mike shouted, clutching his injured arm. No way. We're too deep in now. Tom argued, but his resolve was faltering. Before they could decide, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as a police car screeched to a halt outside. The men panicked, scrambling for the door, but Duke blocked their path, snarling and snapping at their heels. The front door swung open, and officers stormed in, weapons drawn. Portland police. Hands where we can see them, one officer shouted. Tom and Mike froze, their faces pale. They dropped to their knees, their hands raised in surrender. Duke, still growling, stood his ground until Margaret called him back. It's okay, Duke, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. They're here. We're safe now. The officers quickly handcuffed the intruders and began surveying the scene. One of them, Officer Green, approached Margaret. Ma'am, are you all right? I think so, she said, her voice shaky. Thanks to Duke. He saved me. Green crouched down, giving Duke a pat on the head. You've got a brave dog here. He's a real hero. Margaret nodded, her hand resting on Duke's back. He's more than a dog. He's my protector. As the officers led the men out of the house, Margaret collapsed onto the couch, hugging Duke tightly. Her safe, quiet world had been shattered, but Duke had proven that she was never truly alone. The aftermath of the break-in left Margaret's once cozy home in disarray. Splintered wood from the broken door littered the entryway, and the carpet bore the stain of Tom's blood. The police stayed well into the night, collecting evidence, taking Margaret's statement, and ensuring she felt secure before leaving. Margaret sat on the couch with Duke at her feet, stroking his head as tears streamed down her face. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind exhaustion and a lingering sense of vulnerability. Yet, amidst it all, she felt an overwhelming gratitude for Duke's bravery. Thank you, Duke, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what I'd do without you. Duke responded by nuzzling her hand, his warm eyes locking with hers as if to say, I'll always protect you. The following morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of hammering. Her neighbor, Carol Peterson's son, had come over to help board up the broken door temporarily. He was a tall, sturdy man in his 40s with a kind demeanor. We'll get this patched up today, he assured Margaret, and I'll help you find a contractor to install something sturdier. Margaret nodded, offering him a weak smile. Thank you, Todd. I don't know how to repay you. Don't even think about it, he said, waving off her gratitude. The important thing is that you're safe. As Todd worked, Margaret kept glancing at Duke. He still seemed on edge, his ears twitching at every sound outside. She couldn't blame him. She felt the same way. The comforting quiet of her home had been replaced with a constant undercurrent of fear. That afternoon, a pair of officers returned to check on Margaret and give her an update. Officer Green spoke gently, his tone reassuring. The two suspects are in custody. We found out they've been targeting elderly residents in the area, looking for easy targets. Your report helped us connect them to other break-ins. Margaret's chest tightened. Were those people hurt? Green hesitated before answering. Unfortunately, yes. But thanks to Duke and your quick thinking, you stopped them before anything worse could happen here. Margaret glanced down at Duke, who sat by her side. His ears perked. He really is a hero, she said softly. Green smiled. He certainly is. You know, the department does commendations for service animals. I'll talk to the chief about recognizing Duke. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. A commendation? For Duke? Absolutely, Green said. It's not every day we see this kind of bravery. Later that evening, after the officers left, Margaret sat on the couch with Duke. The house was quieter now, but the tension lingered. She brewed a pot of chamomile tea, hoping it would soothe her nerves, and set Duke's favorite blanket near the fireplace. I'll never forget what you did for me, Duke, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. You're my guardian angel. I promise I'll do everything I can to keep you safe, just like you did for me. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Margaret felt a small sense of peace return. With Duke by her side, she knew she wasn't alone. They had faced danger together, and they would heal together, too. In the days following the break-in, the story of Duke's bravery spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors stopped by to check on Margaret, bringing casseroles and flowers, while Duke basked in the attention, receiving countless pats and treats. Margaret, although still shaken, found solace in the overwhelming support of her community. One afternoon, a police car pulled up in front of Margaret's house. Officer Green and another officer stepped out, carrying a small box and an official-looking envelope. Margaret met them at the door, Duke at her side. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," Green said with a wide smile. "We've got something special for Duke." "For Duke?" Margaret asked, her brow furrowing in surprise. Green crouched down to Duke's level, pulling out a polished silver medal attached to a blue ribbon. The engraving read, "In recognition of bravery and service, Portland Police Department." "Duke," Green said, addressing the dog as if he were a fellow officer, "this is for your outstanding courage in protecting your owner and assisting in stopping a crime. You're a true hero." Margaret clutched her chest, her eyes welling with tears. "Oh my goodness. I don't know what to say." The second officer smiled. "It's the least we could do. Dogs like Duke remind us why we call them man's best friend." Green gently placed the ribbon around Duke's neck. The German shepherd stood tall, his chest puffed out as if he understood the honor being bestowed upon him. Margaret chuckled through her tears, patting Duke's head. "Well, Duke," she said softly, "I guess you're officially a hero now." Later that week, Margaret was invited to a small ceremony at the police station. The chief of police, community leaders, and even local reporters were there to honor Duke's actions. Margaret arrived with Duke wearing his medal proudly, his tail wagging as he soaked in the attention. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. The chief recounted the events of that terrifying night and highlighted Duke's bravery. Margaret was asked to speak, and although public speaking wasn't her forte, she couldn't resist sharing a few words about her beloved companion. "Duke isn't just a dog," Margaret began, her voice steady but emotional. "He's my protector, my confidant, and my best friend. What he did that night wasn't just an act of loyalty, it was an act of love. I'm so grateful to have him by my side." The room erupted in applause, and Duke barked in approval, eliciting laughter from the crowd. A local news reporter approached Margaret afterward, asking for an interview to share Duke's story with the community. Margaret agreed, knowing that Duke's courage could inspire others. That evening, back at home, Margaret placed the medal on the mantel above the fireplace, right next to the photo of her late husband. She stood back, admiring the small shrine of gratitude and love that now graced her living room. "You've come such a long way, Duke," she said, kneeling beside him. "From that scared dog at the shelter to a celebrated hero. I couldn't be prouder of you." Duke nuzzled her cheek, his eyes filled with the same unwavering loyalty that had defined their bond from the start. Together, they sat by the fire, their hearts a little lighter, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. The morning after the ceremony, Margaret woke to a renewed sense of determination. The break-in had shaken her to her core, but it also reminded her of the importance of preparation and security. She owed it to Duke and herself to ensure their home was as safe as possible. Over a steaming cup of coffee, Margaret reviewed a list she had written in her neat cursive handwriting. It included everything she discussed with Todd and Officer Green: reinforced doors, additional locks, motion-activated lights, and a modern security system. She placed the list on the table and called Todd. "Good morning, Todd," Margaret began. "I was wondering if you'd have time to help me with some upgrades to the house." "Of course, Margaret," Todd replied warmly. "I'm glad you're taking these steps. I'll come by this afternoon, and we'll make a plan." By the end of the week, Margaret's house looked more secure than ever. The new front door was a solid, reinforced oak with a steel core, and Todd had installed a heavy-duty deadbolt and a peephole with a wide-angle view. He'd also replaced several aging windows with shatterproof glass. Motion sensor floodlights now illuminated the front and backyards, and a state-of-the-art alarm system had been installed by a professional company. The new system included window and door sensors, cameras, and a mobile app that allowed Margaret to monitor her home remotely. The installer walked her through every feature, and Margaret listened attentively, jotting down notes. When the demonstration was over, she felt a small sense of empowerment. "Thank you for everything," she told the technician. "I feel safer already." "Glad to hear that, ma'am," the technician said. "And don't forget, you've got Duke. He's better than any alarm system." Margaret smiled, looking at Duke, who was lying on the porch, his head resting on his paws but his eyes scanning the yard like a sentinel. That evening, Margaret invited Carol over for tea. As they sat in the living room, Carol admired the changes to the house. "You've really turned this place into a fortress, Margaret," she said, sipping her tea. "I had to," Margaret replied. "After what happened, I couldn't just sit back and hope it wouldn't happen again. I needed to do something." Carol nodded. "I think you made the right decision. And you've got Duke. That dog deserves a steak dinner every night." Margaret laughed. "Don't tempt him. He already thinks he runs the place." As if on cue, Duke trotted over, plopping his head onto Margaret's lap. She scratched behind his ears, her heart swelling with affection. "He's not just a guard dog, Carol. He's my family." Carol's expression softened. "You're lucky to have each other." That night, Margaret went to bed feeling a little more at ease. The security measures, combined with Duke's unwavering vigilance, gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in weeks. She double-checked the locks before turning in, and Duke settled into his usual spot by the fireplace, his ears twitching occasionally at the faintest sound. As Margaret drifted off to sleep, she whispered, "Good night, Duke. Thank you for keeping us safe." In the stillness of the night, Duke remained awake for a while longer, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. He would never let his guard down, not as long as Margaret needed him. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal for Margaret and Duke. Though the memory of the break-in still lingered, the strengthened security measures and the unwavering support of her community helped Margaret regain a sense of peace. Duke, ever vigilant, remained her steadfast companion, his presence a constant reminder that she was never alone. One crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret decided to take Duke for a walk to the nearby park. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Margaret wrapped herself in a warm scarf, and Duke, sensing her excitement, wagged his tail energetically as she clipped on his leash. At the park, Margaret and Duke wandered along a winding path lined with towering oaks and maples. The golden and crimson leaves crunched underfoot, and the distant laughter of children playing added a lively backdrop to the serene surroundings. Margaret stopped by a bench overlooking the small pond at the center of the park. She sat down, and Duke lay at her feet, his eyes scanning the area as if on duty even here. Margaret couldn't help but smile. "You know, Duke," she said, scratching behind his ears, "I've been thinking a lot about how much you've changed my life. Before you came along, it was just me and my books. But now," she paused, her voice thick with emotion, "now, I feel like I have a reason to keep moving forward." Duke turned his head, his soulful eyes meeting hers. It was as if he understood every word she said. A voice interrupted the moment. "That your dog who made the news?" Margaret looked up to see a man in his early 40s standing nearby. He wore a Portland Police Department jacket and held a leash attached to a playful Labrador. His expression was warm and curious. "Yes, this is Duke," Margaret replied with a touch of pride. The man smiled and extended his hand. "Officer Harris, I heard about what happened. That's one incredible dog you've got there." "Thank you," Margaret said, shaking his hand. "He's more than incredible. He's my hero." Harris crouched down, extending a hand toward Duke, who sniffed it cautiously before allowing a quick pat. "He's a good one, all right. You're lucky to have him." "I am," Margaret agreed, her voice soft. "I don't know what I'd do without him." Harris straightened and nodded toward the trail. "Well, enjoy your walk. And if you ever need anything, you've got a lot of us in the department rooting for you and Duke." Margaret watched him walk away, her heart swelling with gratitude. The kindness she had experienced since the break-in reminded her that even in dark times, there was light to be found in the people and animals around her. As they made their way home, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since Duke came into her life. She thought of the frightened dog she had met at the shelter, and how he had grown into a protector and companion who had given her a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. Back at the house, as the sun set and the familiar warmth of the fireplace filled the room, Margaret sat with Duke by her side. She reached out to touch his medal, now hanging on the mantel, and whispered, "You've earned every bit of this, Duke." The dog let out a contented sigh, laying his head on her lap. Margaret gazed out the window at the moonlight filtering through the trees, feeling a peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain. She and Duke would face it together. The nights in Portland had grown colder, and Margaret found herself spending more time by the fireplace with Duke curled up at her feet. Her home, once a target for danger, now felt like a fortress of safety and love. The medal hanging above the mantel served as a daily reminder of Duke's bravery and the bond they shared. One particular evening, Margaret brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into her favorite armchair. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the fire, and Duke lay beside her, his eyes half closed but his ears alert to every creak and rustle of the house. Margaret gazed out the window, the silver light of the moon casting long shadows across the yard. The events of the past weeks played in her mind. The terror of the break-in, the outpouring of support from her neighbors, and the overwhelming pride she felt for Duke. She reached down to stroke his head, her fingers sinking into his thick fur. "You've given me so much, Duke," she said softly. "More than I ever thought I'd have again." Duke opened his eyes and looked up at her, his gaze steady and knowing. Margaret smiled, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I've been thinking a lot about promises lately," she continued. "I promised myself I'd take care of you when I brought you home from the shelter. But you've done so much more for me than I could have imagined. You've protected me, given me purpose, and shown me what loyalty really means." Her voice trembled slightly as she went on. "So, I want to make another promise, to always keep you safe, to give you the best life I can. Because you've given me mine back." Duke nuzzled her hand, his tail wagging gently against the floor. The simplicity of his response brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She bent down and hugged him, her arms wrapping around his strong, warm body. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, her cheek pressed against his fur. "But as long as we have each other, I know we'll be okay." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine. The world felt quiet and still, as if it, too, were pausing to acknowledge the moment shared between Margaret and Duke. As the fire crackled softly and the moon climbed higher in the sky, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She realized that the bond she shared with Duke wasn't just about protection or companionship. It was about love in its purest form, built on trust, resilience, and an unspoken understanding. She sat back in her chair, Duke resting his head on her lap. Together, they watched the flames dance in the hearth, their hearts beating in quiet harmony. Under the light of the moon, Margaret made a silent vow. Whatever challenges life brought, she and Duke would face them together, stronger, braver, and unbreakable. Don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and check out the next story. It's truly heartwarming.